Sheldon Richman, I'm so pleased to be here with you. This is a historic occasion. I mean, your new book is out. I think you held up a copy of it.
There it is.
Yes. This is the book that is going to change a lot of things. It changes permanently the way you think about the U.S. Constitution. You've gotten just rave reviews for it going into it. I know you worked on it very hard. It's a culmination of a lifetime of research. And you can buy it right now on Amazon. And the title is?
You helped give me the title. America's Counter-Revolution, the Constitution Revisited.
Yeah, and just so awesome. I mean, it's just, well, I have my own ideas on this, but why do you think that's important that people rethink the Constitution?
Well, as a general matter, before we even get to the Constitution specifically, it's very important that libertarians understand history. Because if you send a libertarian out who may know the theory very well and be all full of a priorism and thinks he knows history and has been doing history a priori, he's going to get slaughtered on campus, let's say, when he runs into a student or a professor who knows the history, who does know the history. He'll be slaughtered and he'll be disillusioned and he may give up. He may say, man, maybe this libertarianism isn't for me, or activism isn't for me, and maybe he'll never say another word because he's afraid of being humiliated again. I mean, I had similar experiences when I was a college student, and I thought I knew history because I knew libertarian theory. Isn't that all you need to know? Of course. Well, no, it's not. So that was number one. That's why I thought I had to emphasize history. The reason I picked this, could have picked lots of episodes in American history, of course, but the reason I picked this is because, you know, it's at the very founding, and libertarians and a lot of other people have this idea, libertarians specifically, have this idea that the founding was essentially, maybe some details were not good, but essentially a libertarian, constitute a libertarian story. And, you know, you hear libertarians and libertarian organizations talk about the Constitution all the time, as if it had this immaculate origin, that the framers, okay, maybe with the exception of Hamilton and a couple of others, but generally they were demigods. They were unique people at this unique moment in time, unlike any other human beings that ever walked the earth. And they created a free country, and then it all went bad, either in the New Deal or the Progressive era or the Spanish-American War. You know, pick your Constitution were very different from the men who wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, this is the problem. We talk about the founding, but we conflate, don't we? We conflate the Declaration and the Constitution.
That's right. And I don't get in this book doesn't get into the revolution, you know, whether there should have been a revolution, whether there's some peaceful means of separation like Canada eventually accomplished, you know, should have been the path. What were the bad unintended consequences of the revolution? That's not my concern here. For about the last 10 years, I've been writing essays about the Constitution, beginning at FEE, then I took it to FFF, and then now I do it on my own blog. And so I had all these essays which constituted nice, short, sharp chapters, I thought. It's not a book that's going to be intimidating for people to read who don't have a lot of time. I mean, there's how thick it is. It's about 140 pages.
That's the right size of a book.
Yeah. This is not written for specialists. This is written for anybody, and most people don't have the time to read some big book, you know, like this thick, full of footnotes and everything. Although I document it, I quote people, I tell you where quotes are coming from, and I have a list of sources in the back, so it's not just floating out there. I wanted people to read it and understand that there was not an immaculate founding. I mean, it shouldn't be a radical idea to say these were human beings with all the same kinds of foibles and perverse incentives that people have in all eras and all times. Why it strains credulity to think that moment in 1787, when the convention was called in Philadelphia, when they met, that somehow that was different from anything that came before or after. I mean, why would you believe that now that we're grown up? Maybe you believe it when you were a kid. But
can you give me an example of the kind of attack that an a priori style libertarian who thinks that the Constitution just embodies a sort of a, you know, true freedom might face at the college level? I mean, are you talking about from the left or from the right or from both, just historians, or what?
Well, possibly from both, because the right, of course, has a there's differences, of course, but there does seem to be a dominant idea on the right about what the Constitution really means, and then the left has another sense of what it really means, and some of them may feel that, oh, this was just, a bunch of property owners who were making sure to keep their property safe from the hoi polloi. There's something to that. But that's a much more complicated story, and it's not. And in general, it's not bad for property owners, assuming they legitimately gained the property, want to keep it. But of course, a lot of property was gained illegitimately, so that's a libertarian story that has to be gotten into. And while I don't go in depth to those kinds of issues, I certainly mention them and name books that people could read if they want to pursue it further. So let me think of a particular example. Well, I mean, you do find on the libertarian side and among some conservatives that these were essentially, their main goal was protecting individual freedom. That they wanted a free society that was essentially, speaking for the libertarians now, essentially libertarian, and that things went wrong later on, like I say in the progressive era or even later than that. I've heard it said, and I hear it often. I even read it today, that they made sure there could be no standing army. They outlawed paper money. They did this, that, and the other thing. None of which is true. There is a standing, or they argued for a standing army. There's no prohibition on a standing army. In fact, the Congress is authorized to create a standing army. Notice in the Bill of Rights, which was added later, of course, there's a provision that says you can't put the army in people's homes in peacetime. Well, if there's no standing army in peacetime, why would you need an amendment that says you can't put soldiers in people's homes in peacetime? There was a standing army. People issuing their own paper money weren't forbidden to private banks that could issue paper money. People didn't dislike paper money for the most part. Remember, libertarians seem to have this a priori idea that since they only like hard money, the real Americans back then only liked specie, gold and silver. Not true. They used paper money, readily used paper money. Some people were afraid of it, but it actually kind of worked. I can talk about that a little bit. I don't, I'm a good Austrian as far as money goes, and I don't like state fiat money. But that doesn't mean each and every example of it ended in a disaster. So there's a lot of it must have been this way without ever bothering to go look at the record.
Well, let me add two additional things. The permission for patents, for example. I mean, I'm not sure how much controversy was around that, but there you have a clear example of an industrial monopoly. Just a state-granted privilege,
right?
That many classical liberals of the time saw as a state-granted privilege. That's at the heart of the Constitution, right in there.
Well, let's remember. I'm getting an echo from your side, I think.
Okay.
All of a sudden, it just started.
I can fix that. Hold on.
Okay. I think maybe it's better now.
Yeah. How about now?
Yeah.
I needed to stand up.
Let me see. Am I hearing myself? Okay, I'm not.
Okay.
Let's jump back. Let's jump a step back. If America went from the Revolution to the Constitution, you might, with a lot of charity, be willing to say, okay, they gave it a good shot. We realized looking back that it was mistaken. But there was something in between the Revolution and the Constitution, wasn't there? There was 8 years of the Articles of Confederation, which I'm not defending as a libertarian document. I agree with Mary Rothbard that it allowed way too much government, but it set up a quasi-government that had no power to tax and no power to regulate trade. I still think it was too much government, even without those two major powers. And it also had no power to authorize intellectual property. So then they go to the Constitution, which was a move from decentralization to centralization. Now, I call the old Confederation government a quasi-government because it did exist by virtue of taxation, but it had to go to the states, and the states did the taxing. So it was a second-order government because it didn't tax directly. Now, plenty of people, even some anti-federalists, thought, well, let's give that national government a little bit of power, limited power to tax. It does need some independent power. Not a lot of people held out against that, unfortunately. I mean, no, they weren't libertarian enough, the anti-federalists. But getting to your point about IP, there's nothing about IP in the Articles of Confederation, but there is the authorization in Article 1, Section 8, under the congressional powers, that it may, it doesn't have to, right? It's authorized to institute patents and copyrights. And notice it's on utilitarian grounds. It doesn't say anything about the right to those things. It simply says in order to further the useful arts. It's a purely utilitarian. Yeah, it's not a declaration that it's a natural right to have a copyright or a patent. So I think that's interesting. And it didn't have to do it. It only could do it. It didn't have to do it.
Yeah, yeah. And another example is the interstate commerce clause. There's a lot of talk that you get in sort of normal civic education that the problem with the articles was that we didn't really have a free trade zone.
That's not total nonsense.
It's not.
There was states did not put up trade barriers against each other. The only thing that even comes close to that, and it was only a couple states trying it, and it wasn't very successful, according to Merrill Jensen, was that New York might put up if English goods or European goods came into New Jersey, and then in New Jersey, New Jerseyites then brought them into New York. New York might have wanted to charge a fee for that. Not against New Jersey-made goods, but against European goods. But even those things fell apart because there was competition among the states. And Hamilton argues in the Federalist Papers that if we enact this Constitution, if we ratify the Constitution, we could triple the tariff. He says the tariff is too low. We could triple it if the states get together, and this leads to device. The states were competing among themselves. If regulation and other things became too onerous, it wasn't that big a deal to move from one state to another. And that exercises this power of exit it amplifies voice, the two voice versus exit. But the fact that you can exit then gives you some voice in limiting the burden of government, because people could leave, and the state officials know that. So that puts some downward pressure on the burden of government. I mean, it lightens it to some extent. But if you get them all together in this new national consolidated system, which is what Hamilton, Madison, and the others wanted, James Wilson wanted, then you're lessening that competition to the detriment of the individual. Because now he's got to leave the whole country if he doesn't like what's going on. And these guys were they were against says he foresees the day when the states are merely counties, just as counties are with respect to state governments. In other words, they're really reduced in power. They're just administrative districts. And Madison wanted a congressional veto of state laws. He didn't get it. He had to compromise that away because there were people at the convention that wouldn't hear of that. So they were really trying to reduce the states in significance, which means reduce decentralization, which means increased centralization. That's what that was all about.
It was about creating a big government, essentially. Now, how would you
and national greatness and national greatness.
So
I mean it.
But Sheldon, here's the thing. I mean, how do you? Is your argument just providing cover for the? Are you saying that the current government under which we're living is, in fact, in a strange sense, constitutional? I mean, how do you avoid?
Yeah. I think the movers and the shakers wanted to conquer or rule, and they foresaw even hemispheric hegemony, if not direct rule, but hemispheric hegemony. Even Jefferson talked about he envisioned a Western Hemisphere where everybody spoke the same language and everybody had the same law. That sounds like centralization and engineering. That doesn't sound like spontaneous order and local blossoming and local custom and stuff like that. They had empire on their minds from the very beginning. Look what they did. I mean, Jefferson, who libertarians have the soft spot for, and he was better than most. The Louisiana Purchase, which he knew couldn't be justified under the Constitution. He knew it. He even flirted with the idea of asking the constitutional amendment, and then he said, "Ah, heck with it. Now let's just go ahead and do it." They were out to conquer, and they wanted to conquer it. And what were they going to do with the Indians? Well, we know what they did with the Indians. They kept moving them and exterminated them because they wanted the land. They wanted the white people there.
Can you think of any conditions under which the Constitution has effectively limited government? I mean, things have been worse without.
Well, no Constitution can limit government. Only people can limit government. So there have been times, and this actually happens in the Jefferson years, where you get a more restrictive interpretation of the Constitution to the benefit of individual liberty. See, and what I discuss in the final chapter, and also one of the internal chapters, is the idea that words don't limit government. Okay, what is government? Government's a bunch of people who exist in a certain relationship among themselves, and then between them and us, the people. That's what government is, right? That's what government is. That's what society is. It's a set of relationships. So words can't limit a relationship. Even Madison called the Bill of Rights a parchment barrier. So what does limit it? What could limit it is us, by what we demanded and what we refused to cooperate with if we didn't like it. And so there were periods, like I say, Jefferson into the Jacksonian years, Van Buren. For a while, there was considered the Republican Jeffersonian period where people wanted less government, and they didn't, and judges, the right judges were in the right place at the right time, and legislators, and so we get a reining in of government. But then look how quickly that changed. Henry Clay's American system, which was Hamilton's old system of industrial policy and internal improvements and permanent government debt, that ended up prevailing after those more restrictive Jeffersonian years. Words on parchment don't limit anybody or anything. Only we do that.
But in a practical sense, I mean, there are free speech cases that can cite the Fourth Amendment, there are gun rights cases that can cite the Second Amendment, and so on. And if we didn't have that, I mean, what basis would we have to limit government?
Well, Britain has an unwritten constitution, which in some ways has served individual liberty. I mean, you don't need a written constitution. On the other hand, some written constitutions sound very good. The Soviet Constitution talked about freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, but of course it wasn't observed. The real constitution of a society, this is the point of my final chapter, which is called the Constitution of Anarchy. The real constitution is inside the actions and relationships, the daily, generally normal actions and relationships of people, including people in the government. That's the true constitution of any society, which means an anarchy has a constitution just as much as a society with a state. Now, some constitutions are better than others. That goes for anarchy, too. We can imagine anarchies we wouldn't want to live under, just as we can imagine states we wouldn't want to live under. And among states, there's some that would be better than others, right? You would pick, say, the U.S. government to the North Korean government. If you could choose which place to live, you're probably going to choose to stay in the United States. The same thing, which also leads to this point that Pete Leeson likes to make. Even a limited government libertarian should be able to admit that there are preferable anarchies to some state situations.
Right.
And once you get that concession, you've gotten a big concession, and then you can start really working on that person.
Right. I have to say, when I talked to my good friend Stephan Kinsella about this, he said, "Oh, I'm so glad he's come out with this book because Sheldon's convinced me, Sheldon, or me,
Stephan,
of the interstate commerce clause."
Well, don't call it the interstate. See, you're already biasing it. The word interstate doesn't appear in that. It doesn't. It says trade among the states.
Right.
It doesn't say anything about interstate. But among the states, that's a very interesting phrase because there's evidence, and I've published about this. I think this is what convinced Stephan. There are scholars who have studied the language of the time, and among the states tended to be used as a synonym, basically, for among the people of the various states. So, look, states don't trade anyway. So when we say trade among the states, what does that mean? States weren't trading with each other; people were. And in Article 3 about the judiciary, the framers said that the federal judiciary will have jurisdiction when there are cases between citizens of different states. There, they were capable of saying citizens between citizens of different states. Why did they say that in the Commerce Clause? Why didn't they say trade between people of different states? No, they said trade among the states. So I don't think it was ever meant to be limited to interstate commerce. Also, when they debated that was all about protectionism. That had nothing to do with internal trade. That had nothing to do with a free trade zone. That was all about protectionism. They were all mercantilists back then. Even the anti-federalists were mercantilists. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, and excerpts were published in newspapers here in the U.S. But that doesn't mean people believed it, read it, or absorbed it. They all wanted the government to open markets. That's one reason they wanted a big military and a big navy, standing military navy, to open up markets, to be able to threaten war even if there wasn't reciprocity in trade. So they were protected. Look, on July 4th of 1789, Congress passed a comprehensive tariff, which a New York paper declared the second Declaration of Independence. They weren't libertarians.
Tell me about the censorship of the late 18th century. That was very soon after.
Sedition Act.
Yeah, Sedition Act.
Yeah. Well, this is very interesting. When Madison put together the Bill of Rights, there were people at the ratifying conventions in the various states saying, "Where's the Bill of Rights? Where's the Bill of Rights?" Because a lot of state constitutions had bills of rights. So they said, "How come there's no Bill of Rights?" And it hardly even came up in the convention in Philadelphia. Let's remember, Albert J. Nock called the convention a coup d'état. Right? They got there. They weren't supposed to write a new constitution. They were supposed to amend the articles, which would have required unanimous consent of all the states. Instead, they get to Philadelphia, they lock the doors, they tear up the articles and say, "Okay, we're starting over." So, and then it had to only be 9 out of 13, not unanimous. So they changed all the rules. So on, oh gosh, I lost my train of thought.
Sedition Act.
Oh, Sedition. Right. So the Bill of Rights. So people at the ratifying conventions recommended a lot of amendments. They didn't make it conditional, their ratification, but they said, "Here's a bunch of amendments. We want these amendments." So like 200 of them. And Madison goes through them and picks out the ones that really just echoed the ancient rights of Englishmen, right? Press, religion, freedom of press, and the things that we see like in the First Amendment and beyond, trial by jury. They didn't tamper with the structure of the government. So freedom press sounds pretty good, right? But then in 1790 or so, we get under Adams, we get or after 1790, we get the Sedition Act along with the Alien Act, because they were afraid about the French. They thought the French were coming in and taking over. They basically, it was like after 9/11 here. The national security state was not born after World War II, which is the kind of a standard libertarian story. 1947, no. Have it go back to 1789. That was the national security state. Didn't have the technology. So they passed the Sedition Act. You couldn't say something about the president or a member of Congress. The Federalists put this in, right? The funny thing is, when they named the office that you couldn't insult, they didn't name the vice president, who happened to be a Republican, not a Federalist, Jefferson.
Yes, right.
They left him out. You could insult him with impunity, but you couldn't insult John Adams with impunity or members of Congress. So you would think, well, why wasn't that a violation of the First Amendment? What, did anybody take it to court? No. I mean, there was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions where Madison and Jefferson complained about it and said that maybe the states should nullify it. But there wasn't a case that said, hey, this violates the First Amendment. You know why? Because in their mind, it did violate the First Amendment. Their idea of press freedom, which came from the common law in England, was press freedom just meant freedom from prior restraint, not freedom from sanction after the fact. And that's what the Sedition Act did. It punished you afterwards. You didn't have to submit your newspaper to a censor before it came out. But you could get punished and even go to jail after it came out. And that was considered freedom of the press. So they didn't even have our idea of freedom of the press. So these strict constructionists, people who wanted the original meaning, the original intent, then they ought to say, okay, we should have, the government should be able to act after the fact and punish editors and writers for what they've written.
But I mean, your argument, and I'm not prepared to criticize his intellectual integrity, and because I read the book and it was just like, it's so eye-opening, and I'm, by the way, so glad that it's all in one place. The kind of arguments that I've bumped into in various places along the way, but now you've got it all in one neat package.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do.
The thing that troubles me slightly about it is that essentially I worry that you've provided some intellectual, and this isn't a criticism of the structure of your argument, but have you inadvertently provided some fodder for neoconservatives and other statists on the left?
How so?
Well, just by simply saying, the Constitution was not meant to limit government in the way you're saying. It's actually a template for big government, and so therefore, the government should be permitted to do whatever it wants.
Well, it's pretty much been doing whatever it wants. Libertarians have to confront what I call the Spooner challenge, and everybody knows or should know that the famous last sentence from his Constitution of No Authority, where he said, whatever the Constitution is, we know this for sure. Either it's authorized the government that we have, or it's powerless to prevent it. It was powerless to prevent it. And then he says, in either case, it's unfit to exist. But you can leave that second half, that last part of it out. Did it authorize what we have, or was it powerless to prevent it? It's got to be one or the other. And it seems a little late to be worrying that people are going to say, oh, I guess the government can do whatever it wants. It pretty much does whatever it wants. If it doesn't do some things, it's only because of our hearts and minds, not because of what's on paper. If it doesn't shut down newspapers today, or blogs, or all the stuff on the internet, newspapers makes me sound antiquated, right? Blogs, or Liberty.me, it's because they know people wouldn't tolerate it. Now, someday people might tolerate it. Scare them enough about terrorism, and they will, won't they?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, I mean, we've been through a lot. You already mentioned the Sedition Act, but in World War I, the controls on the press were extreme.
As it was in World War II, as they were in World War II also. They had that Creel committee that was supposed to be about public information, but they put the screws to people.
And even now, I mean, it's interesting to me that the radio bandwidth can't be used and television can't be used. You can't just have anything on television, even to this day. So, which is a form of censorship in a way.
Yeah. So I don't think there's a danger that I could make things worse by furnishing arguments. I mean, haven't they already thought up all the arguments they need? Look at that, we got the Patriot Act. It was only because Snowden revealed things that any of it got somewhat pulled back, if it in fact really did. I'm not sure it really did. I don't think I could make it worse.
But but in a way, you're taking away a kind of a staple of rhetoric from the limited government.
And I was warned about that when I was writing this stuff at Fee in the beginning. So, somebody who will remain nameless came to me and said over dinner and said to me, "Don't people need their fairy tales? I mean, maybe you shouldn't be tampering with this." But my answer was what I said in the very beginning of this session, namely that we're ill-equipping libertarians by giving them fairy tales, because they're going to get slaughtered. And they may, like I say, become demoralized and say, this is not for me, or I may be a libertarian, but I'm not going to be talking about it because I don't want that humiliation. So
but I mean,
I don't think we do any good by telling people fairy tales.
But but your thesis is radical and potentially could lead to a lot of upheaval, because I mean, for example, the Cato Institute has been distributing pocket editions of its Constitution.
I know, I got some around you.
Yeah, for 30 years,
I know. Well, you have to ask them about that. I used to carry one of those around a long time ago. before the 21st century started. Look, we still can cite a more distant past. We can do what Montesquieu and some of the great liberal figures did. We can refer to the ancient Constitution. By ancient, and I've been reading about this, and let me put a plug in for someone else's book. How gracious of me, right? Jacob Levy has a wonderful book called Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom, which I've reviewed in the American Conservative. So if anybody wants to just read a kind of a quick review of it and get an idea what it's about, you can find it there. And he points out that there was this ancient constitution, which was a combination of myth but reality too. I mean, it got embellished over the many years. By ancient, I don't mean Greek or Roman. It just meant kind of, an older time in Europe where people were. And you know the story about how the fight between the church and state and the nobles and the kings opened up zones of freedom, not by anybody's intention.
Right.
With Magna Carta, the barons certainly didn't care about the common person. But as a result of the putting limits on the king for their good, they created precedents and zones of freedom that we enjoy today as a result. So we can still refer. There's things in the past to refer to. We just shouldn't talk about the Constitution as if it's some libertarian document or that the goal was to limit government. The libertarians who believe that need to go read the libertarians of the day, at least the people who were closest to being libertarians, the anti-federalists. The libertarian constitutionalists have to pretend they don't exist. How can you do that? Those are our people, many of them.
The other thing is, Sheldon, is that my strong sense is that our normal civic education doesn't even mention them at all. I mean, they were the losers in a big
and the victors write the histories. Sure,
right.
That's right.
But
absolutely right.
I mean, you document the fact there was a gigantic debate. The Constitutional Convention, it was a tiny set of people. They over years of work, eventually bamboozled, got a sufficient number of votes, but just barely. There was a great deal of resistance. Yeah. Made possible only by some people, the moderates, compromising, being bought off essentially by the nationalists. But this debate is almost entirely unknown. I mean, in American life, it's completely unknown.
Yeah, and there were there was a lot of variety among anti-federalists. It's a little misleading to use a single title for them because there were differences. Almost all of them thought the national government did need more power, unfortunately. And I think one reason their loss was inevitable was they conceded much too much. Ayn Rand has this line in an essay she wrote called "The Anatomy of Compromise" that in an argument or conflict between two people who share premises, the more consistent's going to win. And they gave away too much. I mean, there weren't good hardcore anarchists or even close to it. They made very libertarian-sounding arguments, some of them excellent, but they also conceded too much. They didn't say taxation is theft, and so they were willing to allow it. And once you do that, it's a wedge. The other side can then say, "Yeah, but look, you already conceded my argument, so now we're just arguing over how much." So you're a much weakened position. But there were eloquent arguments from Patrick Henry. Yeah. And George Mason, and they weren't even the best because Patrick Henry. Some of those guys had ulterior motives. They might have been concerned that slavery would be jeopardized if there was a national government. The northern anti-federalists tended to be better. I mean, the guys in the South were patricians. They were among the elite of their states, and even though they were against the Constitution, like I said, they might have had ulterior motives. But in the North, the anti-federalists tended to be plebeians, working people. Concentrated. They liked concentrated government. They didn't like there was basically a blank check, which is how it's worked out. I hear people complain about the income tax and how in the 19th century we had no income tax, but in the 18th century basically a blank check was given to the national government, and so an income tax was inevitable. And by the way, the Supreme Court never struck down the income tax on wages and salaries as unconstitutional, despite what a lot of people believe. That's a whole different story, but I do discuss that in the book.
What do you make of the absence of Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson from the Constitutional Convention? I mean, was it a different demographic that gave rise to the Constitution versus that propagandized for the Revolution?
Yeah, some of the better people were absent, right? They were both in France, I guess, at the time. Some of that time, Paine was in the Bastille. So
Yeah.
maybe he regrets that he went to France, but I take it Jefferson was living it up because he was a diplomat, right? He wasn't suffering the fate of Paine. Jefferson was always kind of ambivalent. When James Wilson was a judge in Pennsylvania who was a major proponent of the Constitution, a centralizer, nationalist, and made a lot of speeches on behalf of ratification. And he insisted that the national government could only exercise powers that were expressly, authorized or enumerated. And Jefferson heard this speech or read it and said, and there's a great quote, it's in my book, where he says, "We must be looking at two different documents, James Wilson, because I don't see that, what you just said, that the government can only do what's expressly set out." And other people reacted that way too. The anti-federalists in Virginia said, well, that may be fine if you're talking to the people, but if you're talking to people who have actually read the document, you're not going to get away with that. And this business about express, I have a chapter in there called James Madison, Father of the Implied Powers Doctrine. Now, strict constructionists, people that want to believe that the Constitution was meant to limit the government, love to quote Madison, who said, "The powers are few and defined," right? Famous quote from, I don't know if that's Federalist 10 or one of the others, I get them mixed up, but few and defined. Well, is that true? Well, when the Bill of Rights was being debated, and then when they got to what would become the 10th Amendment, you remember the 10th Amendment says essentially that all powers not authorized or delegated to the national government, to the United States, are reserved to the states and the people. So when that was being debated in committee, Thomas Tudor Tucker, great name, Tucker, maybe a relative of yours, South Carolina representative, said, "I make an amendment to the amendment. I would like to have the word expressly added before delegated." So it would say all powers not expressly delegated to the United States are reserved. Madison stands up. "I object." Why? "All constitutions must have powers by implication." That's a quote. "Powers by implication, or else the Constitution would be an endless list of minutiae." So he opposed putting expressly. That's key, right? Because if you don't have expressly, now you can look for implied powers. He says powers by implication. He prevailed in front of the full House as well. They voted that down. So here's the man who believed in few and defined powers is actually the father of the implied powers doctrine. And conservatives, as well as libertarian constitutionalists, hate the implied powers doctrine because you can get anything you want. Don't forget, we have the necessary and proper clause in there, right? All powers necessary and proper to carrying out other powers are, by implication, included among the powers of Congress. Come up with a good definition of necessary and proper that's not going to come around to bite you sooner or later. Then the anti-federalists complained about that. They said, "You kidding? That's a blank check. Necessary and proper."
The anti-federalists must have been very very persuasive in a way, because reading the Federalist Papers, vast amounts of their rhetoric are all about how completely how this Constitution is designed to guarantee a free society, how completely different.
Yeah.
The president.
Well, not quite though. And I quote at length Hamilton's couple of Federalist entries on why a standing army is necessary. And there he says, since the things that government may face in the future are unlimited, how can we limit the powers?
Yeah.
He says this. He puts it in capital letters. You'll read. I maintain the capital letters in the book.
But he goes to great lengths to distinguish, for example, the powers of the president from the powers of the king. Just as an example.
Yeah, but he essentially wanted a king. He couldn't get it.
Yeah.
And when they went to Philadelphia, part of the motive was to reintroduce elements of monarchy, because they thought the American people were much too concerned with only their narrow commercial interests, and they were using the state powers, the state legislatures, to kind of get benefits, which as a libertarian we would say they shouldn't do. And so their answer to that was, we need the national government to be the mediator, the arbiter of conflicting individual interests. They said in a monarchy, that's what the king does, even though it's not always lived up to. And so Madison and others said, they used the word monarchy, that we need to reintroduce elements of monarchy in order to bring about a good, civic republican environment.
And it's certainly true that George Washington himself, right, really lobbied for and pushed hard for all the signs of monarchy to surround him. But there was some fear at the time that the people would sort of catch on. Yeah,
I mean, the people were radical in a sense that they didn't like elitism. They were very nervous. When they overthrew the British, part of what they were also overthrowing were the aristocracies within the states. Jensen talks about there was an internal revolution as well as an external revolution. They didn't like rule by elites and aristocracy inside, and that's one thing that the Anti-Federalists stressed, that the new Constitution would produce an aristocracy. And Madison and those people talked about the Constitution of the new federal government being a filtering mechanism so that the wrong kind of people wouldn't get in office. They talked like that, and that's again spelled out in the book. It was an aristocratic move.
Yeah, tell me. By the way, and I want to take issue with your characterization. I mean, sometimes I think, Sheldon, you don't distinguish enough between the kind of state that we hate in the 20th century and that which preceded it, which was always pillaging, always grafting, always annoying, always doing terrible things, but wasn't quite, defining the terms by which you could contract your work, wasn't taking your income, wasn't starting global wars, wasn't inflating the currency without limit, wasn't strictly defining work hours, this kind of stuff. I mean, it's really outrageous, but and I want to get to that in a second, but which I have a hard time. Even as low an opinion as I have of the Federalists, I have a hard time believing that they would look at the kind of state we have today and go, "Yeah, that's what we want." That's what we want.
No, and I'm not saying that they would. Look, people. First of all, if you go back to an earlier point in history, people don't immediately think of everything or of all the implications of what they want to do. So, I'm not saying they would say, "Oh yeah, this is what we were aiming at." Maybe they'd shrink from horror and say, "Oh my gosh, what did we set in motion?"
Right.
But the point is, they did set it in motion.
I see. Well, that's a very interesting sort of point. I mean, and you get these modern day Hamiltonians, saying that everything we have today, Hamilton would love, and I read him, and I'm not quite sure about that. I mean, there's a kind of like, even as the worst of the worst guys among the Constitution's framers and the Federalists. There was an element of liberalism about them. I mean, they're product of their times, and maybe they just believed. Maybe they were like Machiavelli, and they believed that you needed a very strong central state in order to protect and guard liberty against something worse. I mean, have you thought about that?
Well, look, given what they were saying, and I think we really can't come to that conclusion. I think they cared about individual liberty. They didn't want a dictatorship. They didn't want arbitrary government. They did want process, predictable process, because they lived under a king, and he could one day just order the Boston Harbor closed. No, they didn't want that. They wanted due process, but that's not the same as limited government. Okay, that's not the same as strictly limited government. They also thought that a government, if it was going to endure, and if this new country was going to endure, it was going to need a large amount of consensus. In other words, support. I mean, they understood the Etienne Boete idea. I didn't come across anybody that cited Boete, but you're familiar with him. The idea being that in any society, the number of people ruled is far larger than the number of rulers. So if those people ever decided one day they didn't want the rule anymore, they could end it just by sitting down and not cooperating. It doesn't happen for one reason or another. There are problems of collective action, right, where nobody wants to be the first. But nevertheless, it's still true. The rulers are a small group that sits on top of a much larger
the 1%, so to speak.
Yeah, so there's a potential for trouble. So the American founders and framers were smart enough to know, no, we don't want to offend large numbers of people, or else this young country won't last. It'll fall apart. And they wanted it to last. Why did they want it to last? Not primarily. They wanted to be the new empire. I believe they saw the revolution as the new rising empire, prevailing over the old, dying, exhausted empires, namely England, Spain, and France. This is how they thought of it. We were the new now. They were the old. They were the old.
Why you needed a constitution, I mean, which, after all, and this sometimes people forget this, it was about the creation of a state.
Yes, a merchant, what was known as a fiscal merchant state that could not. You needed it if we were going to be in the big leagues with the other states.
Yeah.
And they wanted national greatness. It was 1800. So it's after ratification, but there's a guy that I came across named Abraham Bishop. He was like a Jeffersonian Republican, and I use it as the epigram in the book. He says, a nation, he's saying this in 1800 now, a nation which makes greatness its pole star can never be free. Do you believe that? In 1800, the guy's saying that. Who's he saying it to? He's saying it to the Federalists, and even the Republicans, the Jeffersonians, because Jefferson, was one of the most expansionist presidents we've had. I mean, the Louisiana Purchase was huge, and so was those that followed him. John Quincy Adams expands even further to the Pacific.
Again, I mean, this kind of expansionist imperial state, to gather ever more territory unto itself, to exalt a ruling class. To find scammy ways of gaining revenue to reward its friends. I mean, these are just stupid things that the governments have always done, right? But that's really different from a government that's involved, today in regulating the operation of gas cans and how long your showers can be, and what can be in your detergent, and surveilling all of your communications. And I mean, we really live in a kind of totalitarian system, and have, I would say, since about 1908 or something like that. I mean, it's hard to imagine.
But those things weren't unheard of back then. There was a lot of stuff going on in the States. You'll recall the book by Jonathan R.T. Hughes, The Governmental Habit, and then he revised it to The Governmental Habit Redux, where he argued, and he's I think Higgs studied under him, Bob Higgs. He was a libertarian. I mean, he was definitely a free market guy. That book documents how the states had all kinds of regulations and various kinds of welfare programs going back into colonial times.
Yeah.
So this was not new. In fact, I have something in the book that also sheds light on that. When Patrick Henry is complaining about the Constitution, he says the following. He says, this isn't going to leave anything to the states but taking care of the poor and maintaining the roads. So isn't it interesting that he said taking care of the poor? In other words, that was already going on at the state level, taking care of the poor.
Yeah.
This was not new. Now, am I saying it's exactly the same today as back then? No, of course not. But again, you don't just on your first day, even if you wanted it, try to set up everything. First of all, they did have a population that had just gotten rid of the British monarchy and didn't like that kind of thing, didn't like aristocracy, didn't like concentrated power. And so even if a Hamiltonian wanted that, he was going to have to tread carefully, or else he would have probably been out the door. That government might have fallen, and people might have just gone their separate way. So the fact that they didn't put in place the government we see today isn't proof in itself that they didn't want that. Because even if they did want it, you're not going to get that on the first day. You have to go step by step, right?
Well, you have a change in ethos, right? In the 20th century, you have suddenly public policy based on allegedly science and policy experts and that sort of thing. Whereas in the 18th century, these kinds of interventions were rooted in a kind of Republican sense of wanting to maintain order and shoot down enemies of the regime, essentially, right?
Yeah, but opportunists take advantage of what's available at the time. So, like you say, when you get to the beginning of the 20th century and the progressives, they have various kinds of sociological theories they could draw on, or social Darwinism,
Yeah,
and stuff like
demographic
that.
panic.
But that wasn't available to others that wanted a larger government back in the end of the 18th century.
Well, actually,
And that doesn't mean they were libertarians because Hamilton, those guys weren't calling for Social Security.
let me ask you about that, Sheldon, because you would know, and I am curious about this. Because earlier you mentioned something about wanting to create an empire of language. Everything I've learned recently about the erection of the 20th century Leviathan is that it was driven by demographic panic, a sense that the race was being mongrelized, by horrible foreign invaders of different religions and races. Particular concern about Southern Italians and Jews for whatever reason. I don't know why those are on the radar screen, but this is a kind of concern growing out of Darwinism. Do you find any evidence in the founding period around the construction of the Constitution that sort of demographic panic expressed itself, at all? Was there concern about the wrong kinds of immigrants, for example?
Well, they needed people, so no, I think they were generally open to that. Now, if people started pouring in, say, from Southern Europe, maybe there would have been, I don't know, maybe there would have been concern. But I think there was a general feeling we need more people. It was not, the most heavily, densely populated place on Earth, and so I think they had an open attitude toward people coming here. First of all, so many of them had only just recently arrived. I mean, there were native-born Americans. I'm not talking about the Indians now. There were white Europeans.
And there was no national citizenship, so to speak, right? I mean, you really were a citizen of the states, and until the 20th century, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly when that comes in. That doesn't seem to be an issue back then. That's right. But of course, you needed to have credentials. You had to be qualified to vote for the national offices once the Constitution comes in.
Right.
Prior to that, it was all through the states, and some people complained that the Constitution didn't have a property qualification for voting or for holding office, and people wondered why about that. And some stuff I read on that said, well, the states were already doing it anyway, and they couldn't agree on precisely what should the property qualification should be. Should it be land? Should it be just wealth in general? They couldn't agree, and they said, well, the states are pretty much doing this. And the states all had qualifications for white males owning some amount of property. The interesting sidelight, there's no mention of God in the Constitution. And Hamilton, I get this from Gordon Wood, who's an eminent historian of this period. Hamilton was asked, why not? And he said, we forgot. So I kind of like, that's a charming story. I kind of like that story.
Yeah. What if you were around in the 1890s and you would have been obviously an opponent of the Constitution?
1890s or 1790s?
Sorry, 1790s. And you were an opponent of the Constitution and libertarian radical, cursing Thomas Paine for having been languishing in France or whatever. And somebody came to you and said, "Don't worry, if a state wants to secede, that's not going to be a problem. The Constitution, provides for that. This is a compact between states." So it will be let any state that's part of the union right now is free to leave. Would you have agreed or disagreed?
Oh, well, it's hard for me to say what I would have thought back then. But I'm glad you bring up the issue of secession, because it's a good issue. It's an interesting issue. When the Constitution was unveiled after being drafted in Philadelphia, Patrick Henry looks at it and says, what are the first three words of the Constitution? I mean, this is me speaking now. What are the first three words? We the people.
Yeah.
He says, what's this we the people? This is not a confederation anymore. And you notice that the ratification conventions were special conventions voted on by the people. They weren't the state legislatures. So in other words, this was not a union of states. Unlike the Articles of Confederation, which has the term league of friendship among the states in the text, it seems to me that they would have thought, well, maybe maybe there isn't a right to secede. By the way, about the Articles, I should say the full name of the Articles of Confederation is Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union.
Yes.
So maybe they didn't think there was a right. Maybe they didn't believe there was a right to secede then, even under the Articles.
Right.
But I'm not so sure people generally thought the state could leave at that point because it wasn't the product of the states. And the neocons argues today, right? Harry Jaffa, I think famously, has written that no, it wasn't a creature of the states. If anything, he argues the states are a creature of the Constitution.
Well, this is what's awkward about your argument, is that you seem to be actually taking a position that's different from Felix Morley, from several generations of libertarianish thinkers, all throughout the 20th century.
In fact, it's a confederation of states, sovereign states. Well, then they're not paying attention to the anti-federalists. Well, Samuel Adams read the preamble, "We the People," and said, "I try to enter the building, but I stumble over the threshold." That's a quote. In other words, those first three, he stumbles over the first three words. He says, it should be "we the states," not "we the people." So they knew it wasn't a confederation any longer. It was what they called a consolidated government. So I don't see how 20th century people can be saying, "Oh no, it's a collection of states." It is not a collection of states.
So on purely intellectual grounds, you agree with Lincoln's rationale for keeping the states as part of a union.
Well, I would distinguish between the legal right to secede and the moral right to secede.
Yeah.
As Jeff Hummel does. I don't really care whether there was a moral right to secede. People had a right to leave. Now, I don't like the reason they left. Certainly, the Lower South's reason was slavery, not the tariff, I know what people say in some libertarian quarters. It was for bad reasons. But that doesn't mean violence should have been used to stop them. I mean, Spooner was an abolitionist who was opposed to the Civil War. Right? Yeah. He tried to foment slave rebellions. He would sneak into the South and put posters up on trees, beckoning the slaves to revolt, and also the whites who didn't own slaves to help them out.
Right.
He also tried to kidnap the governor of Virginia in order to get John Brown freed. He thought that's the way you do it. You don't get the national government to go to war, which is good. He anticipated war. He knew war would be the health of the state, so he was against that.
But you read the 2-volume treatise by I forget now, the vice president of the Confederacy, not Jefferson Davis.
Alexander Stephens, is it?
Alexander Stephens, who was a very interesting guy, because on one hand he was a dedicated advocate of slavery, but otherwise had a sort of I would say what strikes me as sort of a lot of libertarian sort of leanings. I mean, at least when I read him, I can I feel a little bit groovy with his sensibility. But you're saying that he was that. I mean, you understand why he would make this argument, but you think that essentially it's wrong.
I think if you look at what happened, beginning in Philadelphia, and then the ratification by independent conventions, not by the state legislatures, and what the anti-federalists were pointing out immediately.
Yeah,
I don't see how you sustain the argument that it's a collection of states. Look at the complaints that John Taylor of Caroline was making in the first couple of decades of the 19th century. I mean, the ink was hardly dry on the parchment, and he's complaining about big government.
Right.
And then you get Spooner in the 1880s complaining about it, and then but somehow libertarians think these were great times.
But tell me something about the whiskey rebellion. What year did that take place? And
well, that was under Washington. I don't actually discuss the whiskey rebellion because it goes a little past where I'm concerned. I wrote about Shays rebellion, which happens during the Articles, 1786 and 7. This is in western Pennsylvania. Western Massachusetts. Whiskey rebellion was western Pennsylvania. Just quickly about whiskey, Washington put through an excise tax on whiskey. If farmers turned their grain into whiskey and they didn't like the tax, and they started resisting it.
And what year would this have been? This would have been.
I guess it was during the first Washington administration. So. Between 1790 and 94.
So there you have an example of
And he sends the military in.
Yeah. Then aggressive,
or that might have been, he might have relied on the militia. So I forget the details of that because I didn't deal with that in the book.
Still, it was an aggressive tax that people were resisting. This and
Yeah.
the government felt
it was tax resistance. Look, Americans thought one of the reasons they revolted against the British was over taxes. So they didn't like when the Americans started imposing taxes on them.
Right.
But with Shays rebellion is very, very important because Massachusetts had a big debt after the Revolution, like a lot of states did. And they decided they were going to pay it off in a decade with high taxes. And the politicians had a tin ear, they thought, because they had paid off their 7 years war, the French and Indian War debt, pretty quickly through taxes, and it went pretty fast, and there wasn't trouble. No, except this was a much larger debt per capita, and they didn't realize, people may not like the high taxes we're going to have to pay, impose to pay off this debt within 10 years. Well, the Western farmers didn't like it. After they paid their taxes, they couldn't pay their mortgages. So they stopped paying their taxes. They closed down courts. The government started confiscating their farms because the government agents, the state agents, were liable for the taxes. If they didn't come up with the money was coming out of their hide. So now a lot of historians regard that not as a tax revolt, but as a revolt against creditors, right? Debtors against creditors, a levelers kind of movement, not in the libertarian sense of levelers, but egalitarian revolt. In fact, it's a tax rebellion. And so they did get the state to finally lower the taxes and stretch out the time, but they were, people were refusing to pay, or they couldn't pay. Or if they did pay, then they couldn't pay their mortgage, the mortgage lender, and they were losing their farms through foreclosure because of the taxes. So it was a tax revolt, and they got the legislature to lower the rates. Now, when the Federalists saw this, the Nationalists saw this, they said, "This is terrible. This was an impetus to the Constitutional Convention." And Washington had been already invited to attend the convention by he was named a delegate by the Virginia legislature. He wasn't sure if he wanted to go. He didn't want to go to Philadelphia. He didn't want to get involved. He had gone back, to his farm and all that, Mount Vernon. He had slaves to tend to, So his friends who were keeping an eye on Shays' rebellion were sending him letters and cables. No, I guess they wouldn't send cables, but letters, faxes, emails saying it's anarchy, it's anarchy. We need a constitution. We need to do something because the whole system's going to fall apart. And the British are behind this turmoil. They were scaring him. They were scaring him into going to the Constitutional Convention and giving his endorsement. He was the most prestigious person in the country. If he went to the convention and was named the president of the convention, which is what was planned, that would give it a huge amount of legitimacy and blunt a lot of the objection by anti-federalists.
Which in turn suggests to me that you need to write another book on the Declaration on the Revolutionary War, because how did Washington get this prestige? How was he the most popular guy?
Right. We know that Murray didn't think his performance during the revolution was that good.
Yeah, well, and I don't know if it was
because he objected to guerrilla warfare. Apparently, he thought, that's we need to do it the old-fashioned way where we march, in line like this.
Right, everybody gets shot. But right? But even if
he did, nevertheless, he did.
Even if he was an awesome general, even if he was the greatest guy, the thing that made him beloved and what was in fact war. And this
and a lot of mythology. Had good PR people.
Yeah,
and everybody knew he'd be the first president, and so they wrote Article 2 on the presidency with him in mind, and people were willing to take anything because it's going to be George. We love George.
Yeah,
they allowed for a lot because it's going to be Washington. And when people say, "Well, it's not always going to be Washington," they didn't look past that.
Yeah, it could be Trump someday, for God's sake. It's like, no, that'll never happen.
Yeah, and the anti-federalists were saying, don't think you'll always find the leaders trustworthy, because the other side made that argument. Oh, they're going to be fine men in power, and some of the anti-federalists said, "Can you guarantee that forever?" Hume, who was writing around that time, he died in 1776, but he was writing in kind of that era, said you should make policy as if knaves are going to enforce it. And that was very good advice. I think we long forgot that.
But Sheldon, do you not have any sympathy at all for this kind of old style Republican view that We need to have a strong state, and the reason we do is that if we don't have a strong state, we're going to get something worse, and it's not going to be anarchy. It'll be just purely arbitrary government that elected by the masses, and they're gonna do terrible things. They're gonna pillage people. They're gonna drive out the ruling classes. They're gonna run out the bankers inevitably, and so on. So I mean, that's sort of Republican theory. That let's go ahead and let's have despotism now, so we can prevent universal suffering later. Yeah, I mean, wasn't that sort of a prevailing ethos at the time?
Well, not among the anti-federalists, and there were a good number of them. A lot of the ratification conventions were close votes.
Yeah.
So it didn't win over masses. Look, I think the mistake is, and it's a mistake sort of Tom Paine made, that we could start fresh. It's this Jacobin idea that we can kind of wipe the slate clean and begin again and build society. That's not how societies get shaped. They emerge. And the various works. Leonard Liggio was very fond of writing and talking about this, and I'm just back from a Liberty Fund seminar on the life and work of Leonard, and how freedom emerges from the Middle Ages. How? Not from an overarching state, but from lots of intermediate institutions that sometimes are at loggerheads, but like we were saying earlier, it creates those zones of freedom because nobody dominates. And again, I'll recommend Jacob Levy's book on rationalism, pluralism, and freedom, because he talks about these two strains in liberalism. One is what you kind of said. Local groups, those layers of groups, including the family, I'm thinking of John Stuart Mill now, they can be very oppressive of people. And in some ways they can be. It's not a denial of that. But their answer to that was, we need a top-down liberal state.
Right.
But that top-down liberal state is not going to be some sort of justice dispensing machine. We know this from public choice theory, just from historical experience, and other kinds of theory. We know it's not going to be this dispassionate dispenser of justice. It's going to have its own ideas, its own national greatness agenda.
And sometimes I think that this Republican style theory that that was sort of driving, if you want to believe that it was driving the framers, emerges out of 2 centuries earlier. It's sort of the very dawn of modernity, where you have large scale commercial institutions for the first time coming about. The Medici banks and actually capitalist builders and that stuff. And the masses are deeply confused by this, and we're prone to periodic pitchforks and lanterns, sort of witch burnings, and driving out the capitalists and the users and so on. And Republican theory sort of comes out of that experience, like the people. God bless them. Can't manage their own affairs. If they keep this up, they'll unravel everything.
But that's mythological. I mean, people were managing their own affairs. You had free cities in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
You had these. You had the merchant law spontaneously emerging that had nothing to do with the state. Again, this is Leonard Liggio's writing. Harold Berman, Lon Fuller, Bruno Leone. I mean, this is all libertarian canon, right? One of the great values, I think, of Jacob Levy's book is that it shows you how destructive the myth of the social contract is. This idea that we all sat under a tree and decided, we all entered into a contract and created society. That's not what happened.
Right.
And if you think that if it didn't exactly happen that way, we should act as if it did happen that way, we get ourselves into trouble. We have to understand that societies evolve, and there are already lots of intermediate institutions, and those are the things that tended to protect individuals, even if that wasn't the intention of anybody, and that this pluralism is really a better safeguard for liberty. Not to say it's a guarantee. There are no guarantees. We need eternal vigilance, like James Philpot Curran put it. I mean, he was the one who actually talked about eternal vigilance being the price of liberty.
Well, if you're going to if you're going to sort of accuse the framers of the Constitution of one dominant error, would you say that it was intellectual error, or would you say that this really was just a kind of a ruling class, sort of padding its nest and really just seeking to guard its own privileges against sort of a laissez-faire they figured it was otherwise going to run free? Or do you think those interlock, to the point that...
No, look, one thing we have to remember when we talk about history: people are always complicated. People are complicated. I think they wanted to create a great empire, a great nation, a great empire. They thought that was the future, and they thought Americans were, in a way, the chosen people. You know what Jefferson's proposal for the seal of the United States was? It was the children of Israel standing before a pillar of light coming down from heaven.
Mm.
And he was a deist.
Yeah.
They saw this as, well, as Paine said, we have the power to make the world anew, right? Remake the world anew. And Paine, he's got there's a lot of good in Paine, but that's also a dangerous idea. That sounds like regime change in other countries and stuff like that. There's a downside to that. There's a dark side to that. It's not just we'll be a good example and you follow us. Well, if you don't follow us, maybe we should give you reason to follow us. So I think it's a mixture of motives. I think they thought generally individuals ought to be able to live their lives, but still within the context of a sort of a civic republicanism combined with this sort of national greatness. And so it's not simple. As I say in the book, this is not a black and white story.
Mm.
There was justified fear that state legislatures were impairing the obligations of contracts, which is why you get that language in the Constitution. They would pass debtor relief, screwing creditors. If a judge found on behalf of a creditor, sometimes you could go into the legislature and get a stay of execution of the judgment. That's not a libertarian thing, to get to run to the legislature to get relieved of your debts. And so I can understand there being concern. Madison talked about that, and others talked about that. But I don't think that's all that was going on. I think if that wasn't going on, they'd be doing the same thing. And I talk about that in the book. If they didn't think the states were running wild, and I'm sure they exaggerated how wild the states were, because don't forget, you could leave the state and go to a neighboring state if things got too bad. If none of that was going on at the state level, I think they would still be pushing for the Constitution, because they wanted a state that could compete and stand up against the European countries. And you can't do that by a mere confederation. Right? Doesn't that make sense? I mean, if you want that, you're not going to be satisfied with the Articles of Confederation. A mere league of friendship among states, that's not going to give us we want to play in the big leagues, which means you need a fiscal military state. They talk that. That's how they talked.
Well, it's funny, and it's such a simple point, and I think this is the point I made in the introduction of the book, or the foreword to the book. And thank you so much for the unbelievable honor that you gave me.
And thank you for that. It's a great addition to the book.
But just that one insight that the Constitution created, a large state that didn't previously exist. That's so obviously true when you say it, and yet that is sort of the last thing that people think about. The Constitution. I mean, like, even to this day, people imagine, which is crazy, right? That the Constitution came along to limit government, right. and that can't be right, because there wasn't a central government before the Constitution. I mean, so it wasn't the document to limit government. It was a document to build one.
Madison and James Wilson say it as they're on their way to Philadelphia. They say, the complaint has not been that there's too much government. It's been that there's too little government.
Yeah.
They say that. Yeah. So to say the American people summoned into existence the national government through the Constitution is, I think, the height of naivete.
Yeah.
And no libertarian should, without even knowing anything, a libertarian should be suspicious of that.
Yeah. No, of course.
So wait a second. I don't think it couldn't have worked that way. If you're going to do things a priori, at least go with your libertarian suspicions.
Yeah, right.
And say, that doesn't sound right. I got to look this up myself. Well, like you say, I put it in one place, and you can find it.
Well, and it has this argument
covers.
Scattered all over the place, and it's been variously compromised by economic determinism under the Beard and so on. And
yeah, but I think Beard. I'm glad you mentioned Beard. I'm reading Beard now. I never read Beard before. I'm reading Beard. I'm going to read the people who criticized him, and then the people that later came along and rehabilitated Beard. I think he gets a bum rap. I think Beard's crime was he committed heresy against the state religion. How did he do that? He said, you know what? He reminded us. Guess what, folks? These weren't demigods. Not demagogues, but demigods. These were human beings. And human beings, by and large, are at least somewhat concerned about their own financial situation. So let's not pretend they were there walking on water and floating on air when they decided what kind of constitution we have. Now, he didn't say that's all that motivated them. His book is called An Economic Interpretation. I have a book right here. An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And he's not saying it's the only interpretation of the Constitution, but he's saying it is one, and it tended to get forgotten, right? We treated these guys like demigods.
Yeah.
They had ascended from, on high, from the high mountaintop. They were really wise, even though none of them had long beards. And they were dispassionate. They were behind the veil of ignorance, right, to use Rawls's idea. They didn't know what their interests were going to be. They only were concerned with fairness and justice. Beard says, that's not how people are. And I think that was his big crime. Because if you read this book, he's very tentative. He points out where there's not enough evidence to say if person X really was holding government securities or held Western lands. In some cases we know, and a lot of times he says the evidence is it's scanty or it's non-existent, like the records were destroyed. And it's more setting out a research program. He's saying, here's what we need to do to find all this out.
Yeah.
And he talks about how a lot of them were just protectionists. They came from the commercial world. They were merchants, and they wanted protection against English goods. Or they owned shipping companies, and they wanted stuff carried on American ships, not on British ships.
Yeah.
It wasn't just securities and land. It was also protectionism. And so there's a caricature of Beard which is not consistent with what I'm reading in Beard.
This always happens when people become really influential. People think they already know their arguments, and they mischaracterize them. This happens again and again. Right.
Now Forrest McDonald, a conservative who's actually sympathetic to Hamilton, has a book criticizing Beard, We the People. But there have been books since then. There's a book that rehabilitate Beard and take another new look at all this. There's a book by a scholar named Robert McGuire, who has connections with Robert Higgs, called For a More Perfect Union, that came out later in the, 90s, 80s or 90s, I forget now, that re-looks at Beard. And, I'm not saying Beard got absolutely everything right, but Beard's not looking too bad anymore. And don't forget, one of my favorite people, and the person I know you liked a lot, because we used to talk a lot about him, Albert J. Nock, was much influenced by Beard, and his great book, Our Enemy of the State, where he talks about the merchant state created by the Constitution at the coup of Philadelphia. He was influenced by Beard. But, if anything strains credulity, it would be the idea that those, how many people there were, 50-some people at the gathering in Philadelphia, did not have their own economic interest the least bit in mind. That's what strains credulity, not that they were thinking, what's this going to do for the value of my government paper? Because they were afraid it was going to depreciate, right? They were holding debt. Or they had lands that the government gave them in return for these certificates they were holding. They were paid with paper certificates. It wasn't even considered money, right? It was just a debt instrument. And the state government started giving out lands. Well, guess what? By what right were the states giving out lands? And there were people living on those lands, namely Indians, but also some white Lockean homesteaders. But the holders of the people who had state claims to the lands wanted a national government with a big army to go in and clear the land for them. Yeah. Land speculation was rampant. Washington was a big land speculator. You don't think they had that stuff in mind? That's what treats us like children. If we're asked to believe that these people never give a single thought to what their own economic interests were. I'm not saying, and this would be the equal fallacy on the other side, that that's all they cared about.
Right.
I'm not saying either one of those things. I discussed it a little bit in my book.
And typically the ruling class always imagines that its own interest is identical to the national.
Yeah, you're right. It's easy to rationalization is the easiest thing in the world to do.
I spent the last year reading in detail about the progressives, and I hope that I regret that we can't have lunch together every day, because I would love to be talking to you about this, but. You try to peer into their hearts. You realize, yes, they were ridiculous. They were outrageous. They were racialists. They were, to some extent, exterminationists. and status and reactionaries, really. But they believed that what they wanted to do was in the best interest of this country and humanity. So that's those things always go together.
That's the easiest thing to convince yourself of, that your interests coincide exactly with the national interest, the interests of the American people.
So let's say again, America's Counter-Revolution. You can get it on Amazon. You can actually
The Constitution Revisited. It's on Kindle also. $7.99
America's Counter-Revolution
for hard copy, and $4.99 for Kindle.
Oh, that's just ridiculous. So that's ridiculous. So I'm going to push it on my social, because I want everybody to read this, and I love the fact you revived this debate. And it's a fun read. It's an easy read, and it's a credible read. Which is nice. So you can share it among your friends, and even if everything you've heard on this podcast, you find outrageous, you owe it to yourself to get out there and have a look. And you can download it on Liberty.me for free. So
there's a PDF we're providing for free. That's right.
Yeah. So thank you for that, Sheldon.
But if you look at the PDF, I'm sure you're going to actually want a hard copy, or at least a Kindle copy. So then go buy it.
No, I mean I've turned against hard copy for years, but this one I have to have.
Yeah. Well, I'm a Kindle guy myself, so if I can get it, I get a book on Kindle.
Well, thank you so much, Sheldon. It's wonderful.
Well, thank you for all you've done for the book. Your foreword is beautiful. It really gets it off to the right start, and people will profit by reading that, and all your plugging and promotion is much appreciated.
Well, let's make this thing rock, and maybe you'll make some money, and certainly America will become smarter.
I hope so.
You mentioned that Walter Grinder said that no one will be able to talk about the issues of America's founding in the future without grappling with your arguments. So that is an unbelievable.
That means a lot to me. Yes. That somebody like that would say that.
Yes. Well, all the best, Sheldon. Take care, my friend.
Okay, talk to you soon, Jeff. Bye-bye. Thanks.